Well, good evening and welcome to the California State Library. And Mike, our wonderful technician, is getting things fired up. We have new technology here in this room, and all of you will be on YouTube if we're going to have video streaming. And when you signed up, that was your release rights that you were giving us. And I do want to point out, my name is Gary Kurtz. I'm the Curator Emeritus of Special Collections here at the State Library, and I'm the Executive Director of the California State Library Foundation, and we are very pleased to provide the funding to enhance the technology in this room. So Gary Noy's presentation will be live on YouTube, and then will be immortalized that way as well. And if any of you had anything to eat or drink tonight, that's also courtesy of the foundation. So I would urge you, if you haven't already, to join the foundation. I think it's a very worthy cause, and it will keep you in food on a monthly basis for years to come. But it gives me great honor and pleasure to introduce the author of this fabulous book here, Gold Rush Stories. And no one knows the High Sierra better than Gary Noy. And he is a semi-retired teacher, I want to call him professor at Sierra College up in beautiful Rockland. And I use the term semi-retired guardedly, in that he's always on the road giving talks up and down the state about the glories of that great eastern mountain range that we call the Sierra Nevada. It's made so famous by John Muir. And he's a native of Grass Valley, and his grandfather and father, two Cornish miners, worked at the great Empire Mine there in Grass Valley. And as a young boy, Gary Noy was lulled asleep by the sound of the stamping mills there. If you ever heard them going, it's pretty impressive. And I can imagine how lucky his students were and are at Sierra College to have Gary as their teacher. They discovered gold of the mind with Gary as a teacher. In addition to teaching hundreds of students over the years, he has made Sierra College a force that is unbelievable for a community college. Through Gary, they established the Center for Sierra Nevada Studies and the Sierra College Press, which is in collaboration with Heyday down in beautiful Berkeley. And it's incredible that Sierra College would have an arrangement like this. This would be something that UCLA or Caltech or Cal Berkeley would be proud of, that it's right here in a community college. So thank you, Gary, for doing that, and his colleague, Joe Medeiros, who is the current editor-in-chief of the Sierra Nevada, Sierra College Press. And Gary, through his books, has received awards from such prestigious organizations as the Oregon-California Trails Association, and his book on Sierra Nevada stories has received the gold medal from the Next Generation Indie Book Awards. But I love the subtitles of his books. Sierra Stories, Tales of Dreamers, Schemers, Bigots, and Rogues. And Gold Rush Stories, 49 tales, was going to be 48, right? No, 49 tales of seekers, scoundrels, loss, and luck. So last, Gary is a frequent user of the State Library's California History Room, and many of the illustrations that adorn this gorgeous, gorgeous book are from the original collections of the State Library. And Gary's, thankfully, a member of the California State Library Foundation Board and is a frequent contributor to our magazine, the California State Library Foundation Bulletin. So it's an honor and pleasure to introduce the storyteller and historian par excellence from Rockland, California, to address us tonight about Gold Rush Stories. And Gary, here you are. Thank you.
Well, good evening, everybody, and welcome to the Temple of Knowledge. Isn't this just an amazing room? I am so fortunate that with this book I get to travel around and do lots of presentations. But of all of the ones I'm doing on the Gold Rush stories, the one that matters the most to me is the one tonight. Because I owe a huge debt to the California State Library. As Gary mentioned, I did most of my research here at the State Library. There are 49 images, one for each chapter in the book. I think it's 44 came from the California History section here at the State Library. The staff here is astonishing. They're amazing. And mostly, I'm grateful for my friend Gary Kurtz, who wrote the thoughtful and elegant foreword for the book and has been one of the great unsung heroes of California historical scholarship for decades. I just want to take a minute. A few days ago, Gary retired from service from the State Library, and he is, very much emeritus status now. And I just want to say thank you to him on behalf of over the 38 years he was here, the thousands of researchers and scholars and writers and historians and lovers of California history who have been influenced so much by his efforts. I bet you, if you look at the books that have been written about California history in the last 30 years or more, you would be hard-pressed not to find a book that didn't have an acknowledgement to Gary or a contribution from Gary. And I believe that in the last 50 years of California historical scholarship, the two most influential figures are Dr. Kevin Starr, the preeminent California historian of the 20th century, and Gary Kurtz. And so I hope you will join me in a round of applause in tribute to Gary. I should mention this too. Gary was responsible for improving my physical fitness while writing the Gold Rush Stories book, because he wrote the foreword, wonderful foreword, and very early on in the foreword, he refers to me as a perspicacious pedagogue. A perspicacious pedagogue. Now, this improved my physical fitness because the first time I read that, it caused me to leap out of my chair and run to get a dictionary so I could find out what the hell that meant. Turns out it's a good thing, right? Okay. And so I'm thankful to Gary for getting my heart pumping. Well, tonight I'm here to tell you some stories. You want to hear some stories? Okay. Okay. Can you hear me okay? I'm here to tell you some stories about a remarkable time period, and that's the California Gold Rush. We have a vision of the California Gold Rush in which we see something like this. We see an independent miner, usually on the back of a mule with a gold pan, and seemingly every one of them came from Alabama with a banjo on their knee. It was more complex than that. This was an incredibly complicated, enormous enterprise. And what I'd like to talk to you about is one of the characteristics of the earliest years of the California Gold Rush, which is the fact that it was virtually lawless. From the very beginning, California went through a rapid transition socially and politically, economically, culturally. It went from Mexican legal authority to military governorship to a self-governing dominion to statehood, all in a matter of a very short time period. And they kind of made it up as they went along. And for periods, there was virtually no law. In some cases, no law. So what I'd like to share with you tonight is a story about some of these people and what it was like to live in those early gold rush days when there was virtually very little law. To talk about the legal system, the beginnings of law in California, and the start of the California Legislature and some of the things they did in its earliest months, one of which is in this room. Actually, two of them are in this room, and we'll get to that in a few minutes. But let's start with this. Let's hop in the time machine, and let's go back to the early days of the gold rush in 1850 in San Francisco. And there is a merchant, and his name is John McGlynn. And John McGlynn owns a freight company, transport stuff. And he's just starting out. He has one wagon and one mule. And in the hyper-ventilated economy of San Francisco, he prospers. So he decides to expand his business to get another wagon and another mule. Well, this is what happens because of the lack of law in California. His business grows. He hires a new driver, a new teamster for his wagon. And he writes to his mother back in New York. He says, "Today I hired a lawyer to drive my mule team. That is all the use lawyers are out here. We pay him $175 a month. That's about $6,000 a month in today's money. So a pretty good chunk of change." He says, he writes to his mother, "When you meet Judge White, tell him that I hired a lawyer to run my mule team." His mother writes back and replies to him and says, I say to you that I saw Judge White, and I told him what you said. And he told me to say to you that he, as a lawyer, must say that you could not have done better in the selection of a driver. For the whole business of a lawyer is to know how to manage mules and asses and to make them pay. The legal community emerged very slowly in California. It was a very weak legal framework because of this rapid transition of legal systems. You add to that to the fact that many of the lawyers who came out here were not interested in law. They came here to mine. And there are many descriptions in the Gold Rush literature of lawyers being seen in their ceremonial clothing, lawyer clothing, with their top hats, bending over streams using their top hats as gold pans. But they failed, as did most gold miners during the gold rush, and they moved on. They were impatient. There was a Scottish writer named John David Borthwick who talked about the fact that everything was so rapid in California. He said the longest time period that anybody ever thought of was a month. After a month, you were an old-timer in California. That impacts the legal system. Lawyers are mining. The legal system is going through this rapid transition. And it leads this man, Elisha Crosby, who was a 49er from New York. He was a gold rush lawyer and politician, civil servant, to write this. He said, "The proceedings of the California courts in 1849 were rather uncertain. In fact, there was very little law of any kind, very few courts, and very little proceedings." The lawyers were a mix. Some of the lawyers were very qualified, some were not so qualified. Some were sober and learned, some were barely competent or worse. And becoming a lawyer was very, very quick in those days. They didn't have law schools. You read with a lawyer, and you could become a lawyer within a few months. Abraham Lincoln famously became a lawyer after 6 months of study, reading law books in an office back in Illinois. He studied with nobody, and he was just certified as a lawyer, 6 months. That was common. So there were lawyers here in California, but there was no law. The law was often local. It was claim law, in which the miners would gather together in local mining communities and make laws that affected them locally. It was not a global legal system, not a state or territorial or regional law system. It was a kind of do it as you go kind of legal system. So the results of this was that in the beginning of California's gold rush period, there are lots of stories of outrageous lawyers and odd decisions and idiosyncratic judges, for instance. Occasionally these legal practitioners were pretty quirky, kind of funny, but sometimes it was frightening. They just made up the law as they went along. And so there's lots of accounts of these less than stellar lawyers and kind of problematic judges as well. Many lawyers practiced in the law of the time period was often the law of force. And here, this is an 1849 cartoon, and you can see up here, it says, "Our law is the law of might." It was not uncommon for legal disputes to be resolved by dueling or fighting. Just do it physically and get it done quickly. And often the code word was swift justice during this time period. And many lawyers practiced in courthouses like this. This is the Mariposa County Courthouse today. This thing was built in 1854. Beautiful courthouse built entirely without nails, but that's a different story. This is the Mariposa County Courthouse today. It looked that way back in 1854. And many lawyers practiced in places like this. And there are tales galore of the actions of these lawyers. And I could spend a month talking about these stories, but I'll talk about one person because he always pops up in the literature. His name was Francis J. Dunn. And Francis J. Dunn was a 49er from Wisconsin who came out here and practiced law quite early. He was a terrible miner and he became a lawyer. And he was frequently mentioned in many of the accounts of the gold rush literature. And there's one story I particularly like. He was very theatrical, very, very florid in the way he spoke and the way he acted in court. And he always had an opinion on something, no matter whether it was relevant or not. He always had an opinion. Well, there was an argument in court, and the opposing lawyer made an argument. And Francis J. Dunn stood up to respond, and he said this. He said, I'll try to do this as theatrical as Francis J. Dunn would do it. The remarks of counsel, Dunn said, the remarks of counsel remind me of a quotation from a classical poet. I cannot exactly recall the name of the poet, and I have forgotten the quotation. But if I could repeat it, you would see it is appropriate. There are lots of stories of Francis J. Dunn and lawyers like this. And some of the judges were also idiosyncratic, too. This is Hugh Murray. Hugh Murray, interesting triangular haircut, was the youngest Chief Justice in the history of the California Supreme Court. He became Chief Justice in 1852 at the age of 26. And he is really famous or infamous, depending on how you look at it, for three things. First, he wrote the notoriously racist anti-Chinese decision, People versus Hall, which barred Chinese people from testifying against white people in court. He's also known for having a hair-trigger temper. He heard someone refer to him in an offhand conversation as the meanest Chief Justice in America. He hunted this guy down. He stalked him, found him, and then beat him with his cane. This, sadly, is not an unusual occurrence for these kind of judges. And the third thing he's famous for is he died at 31. So he died very young. So an interesting, short career. And during this time period, cases were regularly decided without juries and judges. It was kind of made up, quick decisions in often cases. And I'll give you an example of a judge from San Francisco, William Almond. And William Almond was the judge of what was called the Court of First Instance in San Francisco, kind of a district court, we would call it today. His byword was swift justice, very swift justice. Jury trials were not allowed in his courtroom. Lawyers were limited to a grand total of 5 minutes of argument. And most cases, including murder cases, were settled within 20 minutes. He also, in order to get across the fact that this was a new kind of justice in his court, he did not wear the ceremonial clothing at all. He adopted a distinctive style. He dressed in what was called his trail clothes or his farmer clothes. He would sit at the desk in front of the courtroom with his legs propped up on the desk, and during the arguments, he would trim his nails or pare his corns. Yes, Judge Almond. Okay. This was a very interesting court system in those days. There was Judge Joshua Redmond. This is in Santa Clara County. This is where Silicon Valley is today. Very different. This is 1860. And Alicia Crosby, who I mentioned earlier, described Redmond as a man of very little education, rough and ready in his judicial style, and a hard drinker. He was utterly arbitrary in his decisions, some of which were very peculiar and were without regard to any known legal principle. He was fond, very fond, Judge Redmond. He would never refer to himself as judge or Mr. Redmond. He referred to himself as the court. So he would say, the court wants this, the court does this. And he was very fond of the phrase, if the court knows itself, and I think the court does. He's referring to himself. And according to the accounts in the Gold Rush literature, virtually every day he adjourned court with these words. He said, if the court knows itself, and the court thinks it does, we will now adjourn the court for 5 minutes, and the court will have some whiskey. That was the legal system to begin with. But as time went on, when it moved away from the local, haphazard kind of local legal system, there started to be more form to this. The transition from Mexican control to an established, more formalized American government, which took almost 2 years, was essentially lawless. But soon there started to be the idea that there should be a state constitution, that California should join the Union and move away from the self-governing dominion status, ultimately to gain statehood. But it was rocky. It was a rocky road. When the Constitutional Convention selected the little town of El Pueblo de San Jose de Guadalupe, what we know as San Jose today, as the first state capital, this was the first state house, they met. There was an election. This is before statehood. There were 16 senators, 36 assemblymen elected to the legislature, and they met in San Jose in December of 1849. There were 36 inches of rain in San Jose that month. And so when they arrived, it was a murky mess. The water tasted funny, but they didn't care because alcohol was readily available. And so they met. When they met, one of the persons that took prominence right in the beginning was this man, Thomas Jefferson Greene, who was an early benefactor of the State Library, too. And he was among the senators who met in 1849. When the gold rush began, he contracted gold fever, and he came to Sacramento, and he had been in the river city of Sacramento only a few months when he was elected to the California State Senate. People were very impressed by the fact that he had a lengthy legislative resume. He had already served in the legislative bodies of North Carolina, Florida, and Texas, in the Republic of Texas. And he was chairman of the Senate Finance Committee and was very much involved in putting together much of the early legislation. But his tenure is best remembered for this. He gave a nickname to the first California legislature. It gets a bad rap in some history books, but which was very effective, passed a lot of legislation. Hubert Howe Bancroft, whose picture is right up there, once said it was the best state legislature in California history. Because he said, his phrase was, this was before politicians became prostitutes. That was in one of his history books. Well, so Thomas Jefferson Greene, with his lengthy legislative experience, realized that the way you get things done is through compromise and discussion. And in San Jose, with water tasting bad and questionable, he would, at the end of the session, he would call upon his colleagues to gather together. He would say, let's have a drink, let's have 1,000 drinks. The first California state legislature is known as the Legislature of 1,000 Drinks. As a result of this, it did not take much effort to persuade the legislature to comply with this request. They passed a lot of legislation. I'm going to give you some examples here in a minute. But in 1988 in San Jose, at the location where the first state house was, they put up a marker, a brass state seal, and you can see right here, carved into the granite, it says, let's have a drink, let's have 1,000 drinks. And in this beautiful place, they have many of the important accomplishments of early California, Gold Rush California, including that by Thomas Greene. So what was some of the legislatures? The legal system started to develop. Let's talk about it. A couple of them take place in this room. One of the very first pieces of legislation that was passed, only a few weeks after the Constitution was ratified, was legislation that established the state library. And one of the first appropriations of the state legislature was to purchase a bookcase. It was very important to them. And so here, from January to April 1850, this is directly from the Assembly and Senate records of the time period. These are the pieces of legislation that established the state library in 1849. The state did not become a state until September of 1850. So one of the very first state agencies was the state library. That's an accomplishment of the first legislature. Now on something a little bit more grim. There was a problem in early America, in early California, Gold Rush period, in the fact that since there was very little law, executions and vigilante justice was common. There are many, many accounts of vigilante justice, as you can see here, a depiction of executing on the orders of Judge Lynch. You know, Judge Lynch is the term for lynching. One of the pieces of legislation that was passed early on was this. It was procedures regarding execution said that if a local court declared that somebody was to be executed, usually hanged, before that execution could take place, the trial proceedings had to be submitted and reviewed and approved by the governor. That was a way to to tamp down vigilante justice. Well, in Santa Cruz, there was a judge named William Blackburn, and he found a habitual criminal who was guilty of a wife beating, found him guilty and sentenced him to hang. The trial proceedings were to go to the governor, but the judge was so concerned that the rickety old dilapidated jail in Santa Cruz could not hold this guy overnight. They're going to hang him as soon as possible, that he decided to just execute the criminal immediately. The next day, the day after the hanging, Judge Blackburn sent the trial proceedings to the governor for review and approval. And attached to it was a note from Judge Blackburn that said, "In reality, Governor, it doesn't make any difference what you do." There was still this element of this extraordinary make it up as you go along part of California society that lasted well into early statehood. This was a new world. The other part, another example of legislation that applies in this room here. When I thought about what I was going to talk about tonight, I realized that one of the answers is right up there. That's the Great Seal of California. And this beautiful Great Seal of California, which is one of, if not the only one, in which you got the bear eating the grapes up there, which in early descriptions was said that the bear was eating the grapes. That was an early state legislative idea. But there's a story behind the Great Seal. It's always a personal story, a gold rush personal story. I'm thinking you will not look at the Great Seal the same way again after you hear this. September 9th, 1850 is Admission Day, and California was approved as the 31st state, but the state had a constitution and a Great Seal prior to that. In October of 1849, very early on in California, there was a resolution authorizing the design of a Great Seal. And so the description of it includes these elements that we see up here, too. It has Minerva, as the word Eureka, I have found it. This seal, which is a contemporary one, does not have 31 stars. There's supposed to be 31 stars here, representing California as the 31st state. There's the grizzly bear, all of these elements that are put into it. The last time I talked about the Great Seal, I talked in my class about this. They looked at this miner here, and they said, how come this miner is swiping his pick at a giant potato? It looks like a giant potato right there. He's actually digging a hole. But anyway, that's beside the point. This is the seal that we know. And this is the seal that has come through to us. This is the earliest depiction in December of 1849 in the New York Times. But when people look at this seal, and this isn't the 1928 version, you can see here there's some differences. Here's the bear. Bear's really big here. Still eating something, grapes. It's much smaller here in the contemporary one. It's like a teddy bear, not eating grapes. This is my story. I'm sticking to it. The grizzly bear eating grapes, and it's up here on this one too. There weren't that many vineyards in California in 1849. But what was common was grizzly bears. And grizzly bears, according to the accounts, frequently ate manzanita berries. And the nickname for manzanita berries was bear grapes. So I think those are bear grapes. I'm definitely in a minority, I think, on this story, but that's what I think. Well, there are differences through time. This is the thing today with the giant potato. There are some things in this that when people look at this, they're kind of surprised. Most people, when they look at the Great Seal, believe you're looking toward the Golden Gate. You're not. You're looking east. This is the Carquinez Straits or the Sacramento River, and this is the Sierra. There are some elements in here that are kind of curious. There's this mysterious building. Some of these buildings have a dome, some do not. It's believed that it is a representation of the state capitol. And in this one, it is Sacramento, but it's probably the state capitol at Benicia, which was a much more square building. There's also a steamship. This could be any steamship, but specifically, it's the Sitka. And the Sitka was the first steamship in San Francisco Bay. And it was owned by a very intriguing figure named William Alexander Leadsdorf, who was black and an early entrepreneur, Caribbean, who was a very prominent merchant, once owned the land grant of 50,000 acres that includes today's Folsom. When he died at an early age, early in the gold rush, his property was taken over by a guy named Joseph Folsom. The family of Leadsdorf sued Folsom for stealing the Leadsdorf property, but, and this is early law in California, it was against the law for black people to testify against whites. So as a result, the court case was thrown out. Folsom got control of the territory and named the town that had developed there after himself. But if you go through Highway 50 today, through Folsom, that stretch of Highway 50 is called the William Alexander Leadsdorf Memorial Highway. And that's his legacy today. But that boat, he owned that boat, the Sitka. That's part of it. And there are variations as well on this Great Seal. Here, you see the word Eureka is in Greek. Okay, it's written in Greek. Here, in this one, they got the Golden Gate Bridge. Okay, so you're looking the other direction, and there's no mysterious building. Some of these Great Seals in California have as few as 11 stars. Some have as many as 38. It's supposed to be 31. There is a wide variety. But here's the part that intrigues me. Who designed this thing? And it comes from the gold rush, and it's two people. One was a young man by the name of Robert Selden Garnett, and he was in the Army, and he had served for 20 years by the time the American Civil War took place. He came into the Army in 1841. So he served out here in California at the time of the gold rush, and he submitted the original design with all of these elements. But he was concerned about mixing military authority with civil authority. So he turned over the design to a civilian to shepherd it through the state legislature. To bring it up, the story of Garnett up before we move to the other civilian element. When the Civil War broke out, Garnett was from Virginia, a loyal citizen of Virginia, and he joined the Confederacy and he served under Robert E. Lee, but not for very long, because the Civil War began in April 1861. On June 15th, 1861, just a couple of months after the Civil War began, Robert Selden Garnett, who was now a general in the Confederate Army, was killed. He was the first general officer, first general of the Union or Confederacy to die in the Civil War. But for our state seal story, this is the civilian, Caleb Lyon. And Caleb Lyon was a charmer and also breathtakingly corrupt. And when he came to California, he came right at the beginning of the gold rush. He lived in New York. He had charmed someone in the government into making him the trade counsel to Shanghai. And when he came to California on his way to China, he realized he could make more money in California in the gold rush. He stayed here. And not very long after he got here, he became involved in the California Constitutional Convention, and he charmed his way into becoming the secretary of the convention. And he, Garnett, went to Caleb Lyon and gave him the Great Seal, and it's Caleb Lyon who pushed it through. But that's not where Lyon's story ends. He leaves California, returns back home to New York, and there in 1864, President Abraham Lincoln appoints Caleb Lyon the first governor of Idaho, the Idaho Territory. He's only there for about a year. And during that year, they find in a government audit that he had personally embezzled $47,000, the equivalent of about $1.5 million today, that was earmarked to go to the Nez Perce Indians for medicine. Then he became involved with a bunch of charlatans who were involved in a diamond salting hoax. in which they would spread diamonds out on a piece of unproductive land, bring out unsuspecting buyers, and sell the same piece of land to dozens of people, pocketing the money and then skipping town. He was the governor at the time when he was doing this. He was found out, and after a year he was replaced in office. But they're forever linked by the Great Seal. When you look at it, you're going to think of it differently, I think, now. They're linked by the Great Seal and something else. They're both buried in the same cemetery in New York, just a few feet from each other, totally by coincidence. That's early legislation. And one more that I want to give an example of is something that's very relevant today. You've all heard of the state of Jefferson and CalExit. I have had, when I talk about this in class and to some groups sometimes, I've heard, well, isn't this unique? Isn't the state of Jefferson idea new and novel? Well, no. It's been that way since before statehood in California, the idea of splitting up the state or seceding from the Union. It's been around since the beginning. Certain regions felt ignored or left out of the political process, and they felt that it was best if they just broke away from the state. Sometimes it was the northern part of the state, sometimes it was the south, sometimes it was communities. In 1848, in 1850, the town of Rough and Ready, you know where Rough and Ready is, up by Nevada City, seceded from the Union, from April to July of 1850. And they formed the Great Republic of Rough and Ready. And according to the story, the legend, they decided to stop seceding because the 4th of July was coming up, and they wanted to celebrate the 4th of July. But officially, they still were seceded from the Union. They were formally stopped being a secession town in 1948 because the post office wanted to establish a post office in Rough and Ready, and they found out that Rough and Ready was an independent republic. And they ended the secession 100 years after it began. But breaking up the state, CalExit, state of Jefferson, nothing new. And of all of the times in our history, there's one time when it came the closest to happening, and that was during the gold rush. And it was the result of this man, Andris Picot, and a piece of legislation called the Picot Act. In 1859, Andris Picot was a member of the California elite. He was a brigadier general in the California militia, prominent state legislature from Los Angeles. Introduced a resolution. He was angry. He felt that the southern counties of California were being left out in this California gold rush extravaganza, and all of the effort was in the center part of the state. Nevada City was the 3rd largest city in California during this time period. That's how it was all centered here. Well, he introduced a piece of legislation to take the 6 southernmost counties of Southern California and make them a new territory. It was called the Territory of Colorado. Interestingly, at the same time where today's Colorado is, legislation was introduced to carve out a territory called the Territory of Jefferson. Well, at the same time that Picot introduced this legislation, up in the northern counties who were left out, they introduced legislation to establish a new state called the state of Klamath. That one didn't go anywhere, but this one did. This piece of legislation went through the process. It was approved by the state legislature. It involved having a vote in these counties as to whether they wanted to split away from the state. It had to be a 75% majority, 75% plus majority. 78% of the population voted to leave the state. It was approved by both houses of legislature, signed by the governor. Now it had to be approved by the Congress. And so the governor, John Weller, signed the legislation. It was sent to United States Senator Milton Latham, who had just stopped being the governor of California, was the new senator from California, and he said he would attempt to shepherd the bill through the Congress. And Latham, in his report to the Congress, said this could be used today for the state of Jefferson literature. He said that these counties are unjustly burdened. There is no remedy save in separation from the other portion of the state. In short, that the union of the Southern and Northern California is unnatural. That could be used today. His advocacy fell on deaf ears. It's 1860. What's happening? The Civil War. The nation is dealing with a lot of other secession issues around the country at this point, and the bill was introduced in congressional committees, but it never came to a vote. It was just shelved. Once the Civil War erupted, the legislation was forgotten. The Picot Act was not the first, nor it was the last attempt to split the state into separate states or territories. President James Buchanan, who had the opportunity to deal with this legislation, was all hands off about most everything in those days prior to the Civil War. But there were other movements. There have been, since the California Gold Rush, more than 200 proposals to split the state into various sections. This is not new. But the most famous one of all today, of course, is the state of Jefferson movement. And in 1941, this got its origin, and this was the original boundaries of the state of Jefferson movement. In October 1941, states in counties in southern Oregon and northern California proposed breaking away and establishing a state of Jefferson. And this was put together by the mayor of a little town in Oregon called Port Orford. And he said that we needed to have a new state that represented our interests more. Sound familiar? Named the state of Jefferson. This is the part I like about this story. On November 27th, 1941, a group of young men wanted to promote this idea. So they went to Wairika on Highway 99, brandishing shotguns, and stopped traffic. This got international publicity. And they stopped traffic and they issued what they called their Proclamation of Independence, saying that the state of Jefferson was going to be established. There was no violence, no shooting. But then in their Proclamation of Independence, this is the part that tickles me, they said they would continue to secede every Thursday until further notice. So every Thursday they would secede. The current movement has much larger territorial boundaries than that. It's nothing new. The Picot Act was the closest it ever came to happening. There's so many stories in this California Gold Rush. There's just so many. And it was an area transformed by a contagion, by gold fever. And Hubert Howe Bancroft, again, his picture's right up there, said that this was a powerful force that verged on fanaticism and appeared unshakable. And he wrote this about gold fever. He said, "It touches the cerebral nerve that quickens humanity and sent a thrill throughout the system. It tingled in the ear and at the finger ends. It buzzed about the brain and tickled in the stomach. It warmed the blood and swelled the heart." And more contemporarily, T.H. Watkins and R.R. Olmsted wrote this about gold fever. They said it was like some kind of hallucinogen. Gold heightened, distorted, and accelerated reality, propelling spurts, bursts, and great explosive movements. The chronicles of the years that accompanied and followed the gold rush is not so much a history as the record of a seismograph. The California Gold Rush was an earthquake. And we still feel the tremors to this moment. I believe the gold rush has never ended. With all its imperfections and perfections, with all of its clarity and contradiction, it's with us today. It's not a surprise that Silicon Valley is in California, because it's here that you could reinvent yourself. It is here you could take a risk as an entrepreneur and fail with relatively little fallout. That's what this story's about. It's about stories about people like this. And in the final analysis, the gold rush is a story of a journey, a search, and taking a risk. But in reality, that's our story. That's what life is about. It's about journeys and searches and taking a risk. The big difference was in the California Gold Rush, it was incredibly concentrated. And it starts and accelerates and defines who we are. These traits of risk-taking and reinvention are California traits. And the California Gold Rush started this. This was the earthquake that still affects us today. Whether you arrived here yesterday or your families have been here for generations, we are all products of this event. It continues to influence us today. It never ended. It just transformed. So for me, if you seek the California Gold Rush, just look around. Thank you. Could I take questions? Or?
Gary, that was a 5-star talk, a golden talk. It was wonderful. It really was. Yes. Magnificent. But I have one critical question to ask. Is there anywhere we can buy copies of your book? And right over here. Okay. All right. Okay. So, yeah, we have a few minutes. So anyone have any questions? Yes, sir.
The revolutions of 1848 encouraged immigration from Europe to California. What brought all of the Kanakas?
Well, that's related to John Sutter. John Sutter is right there. And John Sutter, let me put it this way. John Sutter was particularly prolific at growing debt. And one of the things he had was trade relationships all around the Pacific Rim, with Russia and also in Hawaii. And as part of an arrangement he made in trade with the King of Hawaii, he was given workers or slaves, I don't know how exactly you want to call them, Hawaiians, Kanakas, who came here and were the original construction crew for Sutter's Fort. So that's how Pacific Islanders really had their origins here, as I understand it. So that was part of it. But it's interesting you say about the revolutions of 1848. 2 little quick gold rush related stories related to that. In 1848 in Bavaria, the king of Bavaria abdicated because he was under the sway of his mistress, Lola Montez. And it was called the Lola Ministerium in Germany, and she got control, and he abdicated, and she fled, came to California. I know that none of the story, because she lived in Grass Valley, down the street from where I was born, and that influenced it. The other gold rush related thing is there was a young writer in London in 1848 who made his living by writing for London newspapers accounts of what was happening in California in the gold rush. You may have heard his name. His name was Karl Marx. And that's how he was making his living at the same year he wrote the Communist Manifesto. So, any other questions? Yes, sir.
Do your books reflect anything about gold rush musician John Stone?
I've heard of him. My book doesn't, no. We have entertainment. There's an entertainment section in there that goes into some of the interesting, like Ole Bull, the violinist, and some of the opera divas, people like that. But not, I know who you're talking about, but he's not really reflected in there. But it's a fascinating story. Entertainment went from the very demure Shakespearean kind of sensitivity to barren bullfights, to bare knuckle brawls until somebody passed out from bleeding. I mean, it was very, very violent to genteel. Very interesting time period. Interesting entertainment stories. Yes, sir.
Was one of the state, I can't recall the state of Jefferson or not, one of the California secessionist movements that lasted quite a bit longer, their big announcement press release was released something like December 6, 1941, right after Pearl Harbor.
Oh, really?
And of course the news got drowned out. I was wondering if that was a state of Jefferson movement or not.
Or it's probably something similar to it, yeah. I'd never heard that. That's fascinating. Now you got me, that's what I'm Googling tonight.
Yeah, I in the last 6 months I've picked up maybe
Really?
15 books on California history, so it's for one of them, and I'm trying to recall that.
Interesting. Have you heard anything about that?
I think that was the one. I don't have all the details, but there was a columnist for San Francisco newspaper, Stanton Delaplane, and I think he won a Pulitzer Prize for his coverage of this very movement that you're talking about. Yeah. So yeah, Stanton Delaplane. Yeah. Yeah.
Interesting. Yes, sir.
Maybe you could clear up something for me. You go back to the 1850 census, and there are enumerators that were out here in July and August, 1 to 2 months before we became a state. What were they doing here?
Well, it was a military government, and so it was part of the census under the American umbrella. The thing with the 1850 census, it is notoriously unreliable because the population was so fluid and transient that a community could swell up in a day and be gone the next, and it may have been the day that census takers were there. So it's very, very unreliable indeed. So, yes.
If I understood correctly, that the Picot Act, they wanted to have it called the state of Colorado. And I just don't remember the history that much. Us being the 31st, and was there like a huge spatial difference because people considered the difference between us and the East Coast, like Sahara Desert is wider than other states, and then the state of Colorado that was the Picot Act, did that become now our state of Colorado, the same people who wanted that kind of form Colorado?
I don't think so. I think, Colorado was used quite a bit for descriptions of this area, and the whole Great Basin was kind of unknown. It's like Mars in many cases, so the names kind of transferred here and there, as did Jefferson from today's Colorado to state of Jefferson to the great American desert. And so it's the same attitudes. I'm absolutely certain it's the same attitudes because that was the atmosphere at the time. There was secession in the Civil War. There was movements. There was the state of Franklin back in Tennessee, and all of these different kinds of groups. It's quite common. So I would think the word Colorado is probably used quite a bit out here in the West. Yes? Do you know, Gary? The question was the town of Sitka in Alaska. What was the connection with the steamship Sitka? So, yeah, that's the steamship Sitka. Yeah, I don't know.
I could be wrong on this, but I believe it was purchased from the Russians. As you know, the Russians had a colony in Fort Ross, and one of their ships was called the Sitka. I could be wrong on that, but I think that's where it came from. And William Leidesdorff, yeah.
Commercial interests throughout the region, as did Sutter, but Leidesdorff was more successful with the Russians too. They were major trading partners in this, and there was actually, where Fort Ross is, the Russian community dropped much farther south than that, basically to around Petaluma. And so it was very close to San Francisco, and Leidesdorff's headquarters was in San Francisco. So it's very possible that he purchased that ship from the Russians. So.
One of my favorite nicknames in Southern California, trying to break away from the north because of its very small population, that Los Angeles, and maybe some of you know this, was called the Queen of the Cow Counties. And that's how Southern California was referred to, the cow counties.
Wow. Well, thank you so much, everybody. Please. Please, there's lots of food, courtesy of the California State Library Foundation, and there's books available. I'll be happy to sign them for you. And thank you so much for coming tonight.